So thank you for everyone for being here with us today. This work was prepared for the Ging olx Village Government, or GVG, exploring policy options in the context of large infrastructure development. So we'd first like to give a few acknowledgements. This work was prepared for the GVG and all outputs will be under their purview. All the work was prepared to the best of the researchers' understanding and is not necessarily indicative of the views of the community or the GVG. We'd also like to thank Corinne McKay, Melanie Dulin, and all the community members who spoke with us. Your trust was not taken lightly, and we're honored to have worked with you. We'd also like to acknowledge our positionality as settlers and immigrants. This work was prepared to serve the community, however the community deems most useful. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the colonial legacy of UBC and hope that this work contributes to the growing movement of decolonization and reconciliation. So a bit of context about the village of Ging olx. It is considered the seafood capital of the Nass. It sits at the mouth of the Nass River. It is one of 4 villages within the self-governing Nisga'a Nation. It's home to approximately 400 residents, and some of the main industries are fishing, tourism, and construction. So what really inspired this research was the Ksi Lisims LNG project. The project itself is not the focus of our study, as it is under the jurisdiction of the Nisga'a Nation. It is a floating liquefied natural gas export facility that will be located in and nearby the village of Ging olx, but many processes are already in place for its development. Therefore, we decided to focus instead on the policy window created by this development to focus on socioeconomic development more broadly. So we aim to provide the GVG with examples of socioeconomic development in similar communities and projects, with examples of Indigenous self-governance, evidence-based policy, and obtaining the support of the community. So I'm going to pass it over to Prajna to tell you a bit about how we went about this.
Thank you, Paige, and hi, everyone. So our research methods had 3 main components to it. The first was the conversations that we had with community members. We spoke to representatives such as elders and business owners within the community to get a sense of some of the values and ensure that our research was driven by the community's values. And it was their values and narratives on economic development were embedded within our research. The second component of our research methods involved the literature review. We also wanted to make sure that the work that we are undertaking is also based on theoretical understanding and some of the academic research that has happened in this area. And lastly, we also looked at case studies. Our initial sort of approach to the case studies was much broader. And as we went through the process and put together the interviews with the conversations with community members, as well as the literature review, we came to a point where we could finalize our case studies based on criteria of economic development, as well as their degree of similarity to the Ging olx village. And now, what we were aiming to do was not provide an explicit framework, but to sort of give a sense of what are the emerging practices within this theme. And now I pass it on to Arthur.
Great. So what did our research, how can we sort of frame and categorize our research? Well, we developed sort of this graphic in order to kind of show our findings. And so ultimately, when it came to case studies, we were able to cluster it into 3 particular practices, which you see in the middle. But we also found during this research process that there were a lot of cross-cutting themes that emerged. So items that ran across all of the practices in order to be necessary in terms of being considered. And so within the next sort of couple of slides, we're going to be talking about a little bit in brief these different sections, but starting with sort of the cross-cutting themes, which Surabhi will talk about.
Thanks, Arthur. So when we did our research, we saw that there were 4 main cross-cutting themes that emerged when we look at factors affecting economic development in all of the case studies and the 3 practices that we will discuss next. The four cross-cutting themes were including increasing governmental consultation processes with the community members and trying to build transparency with them. Next, the government can collect data about different gender identities, differently abled people, two-spirit persons, and different age groups, and include them in new business ventures. This ensures that there is representation of marginalized voices in government schemes. The last cross-cutting factor was that the community members often collaborate to create a community vision about economic development. This vision can be included in practice in government schemes to ensure good governance. We'll see that these cross-cutting themes emerge across all the case studies that we will look into the presentation. I'll now hand it over to Prajna to discuss first practice.
Thank you, Surabhi. So the first thing that the first practice we're going to look at is the governance practice. When we looked at the literature around this, governance was seen to be a key factor to support economic development. And the literature often advocated for a separation between the political bodies and the economic entities. And you can see that on the slide in front of you. The way this would work is where the economic entities are responsible for their day-to-day workings, but they are in the long run answerable to the political bodies. And the political bodies are responsible for creating that atmosphere and environment for economic development. So we saw cases where communities achieved economic development and successfully achieved that with this separation. But that is not to say that the separation is necessarily a key criteria, because we also found case studies where the separation wasn't needed. So some of the other factors then that go into good governance, and this also sort of connects to the cross-cutting themes, it is transparency, accountability, the sort of the models that they choose to pick for their corporations, such as a limited liability model or cooperative models. Another key factor that came across as part of good governance was having a strategic goal in plan and investing in your administrative abilities. Next slide. So the case study that we did look at, and we did a few more case studies on governance, which is in our longer presentation, was the Tahltan First Nation. And the slide in front of you presents the structure and how they achieved this separation between their Economic Development Corporation and the government body. So the Tahltan Central Council was formed in 1975. Their Economic Development Corporation was formed in 1985. Around this time, they had very high rates of unemployment, with about over 90% of the community being unemployed and 80% of the community being on welfare. Currently, their Economic Development Corporation is valued at $25 million. As you can see in the slide in front of you, they achieve this separation by having agreements that will define the roles and responsibilities of the Tahltan Central Council, as well as the Tahltan Nation Development Corporation, right? And all the work that is undertaken by the Development Corporation is guided by their code of ethics and their resource development policy, essentially centering the community within all the work that they do while achieving a degree of separation to ensure that they can carry out their day-to-day activities. And as you can see in the slide in front of you, all of the dividends and the benefits get rerouted back to the community, again, centering the community despite that separation. Now I'll pass it on to Surabhi to discuss the next practice.
Thanks, Prajna. In this practice, we'll explore how local leaders can help jumpstart economic development in their communities. To start with, local leaders are great at navigating economic development because they can identify developmental bottlenecks, such as shrinking supply chains or increasing distances with the market. They can also identify community assets, which helps them jumpstart economic development. They're also effective in engaging with community to understand their community vision of development and can include this vision in developmental plans. Plans that include community vision have a higher chance of succeeding. Their next success comes from the fact that they have knowledge about their community. They have historical and cultural knowledge about the community, which they can then use to devise economic goals. And these goals are contexted with the cultural strength of the community. Lastly, they can hold consultations and surveys with the communities to collect data that drives economic development, such as the age of population and the education levels. This data can then be used to formulate new policies around economic development. We'll now take a look at the case study, the Osoyoos Indian Band, to understand how leadership can affect economic development. The band started its economic development in around 1988, when the unemployment rate was around 3%. Since then, the unemployment rate has been around 3%. And the economic corporation is going to make about $36.1 million in revenue by the end of this year. The leadership of Chief Clarence Louis is the large attribution of why the band has been doing so well economically. So the first decision that he took was in 1988 about getting outside experts to help with business development, as the band did not have enough experts to help with business development. The next decision came around when the band started to make investments in business opportunities. The band had around 32,000 acres of agricultural land, and it decided to make investments in silviculture and wine production to use existing assets and existing expertise. The last decision was taken when the chief realized that the education needed more investment because the workforce was aging and the younger generation did not have enough skills for business development. I'll now pass it on to Arthur to look at the new practice.
Thanks, Surabhi. So the last sort of sets of practices that we've identified within the case studies that we've looked at was the sort of deployment from a community perspective of monitoring and evaluation systems. And so while projects such as Ksi Lisims might entail sort of their own monitoring processes, really what this was focused more on was how community governments and community administration can develop their own monitoring practices on top of project monitoring to be better oriented in terms of dealing with uncertainties and policy making. And so ultimately what it seems to suggest is that there really isn't sort of a one size fits all when it comes to the selection of indicators for economic development. And in fact, actually successful monitoring very much includes the involvement of integrating community values. And so this not only ensures that there's more community buy-in when it comes to establishing the indicators and how to actually monitor, because now you've incorporated more members that would be engaged in the process, but it also ensures that what indicators are selected are useful in terms of conducting effectiveness of the actual economic development programs themselves. And so ultimately, monitoring should really help to inform policymaking at the end of the day, rather than be simply just another administrative process that you set up and confuse policymakers. And so the notable sort of case study that we've wanted to highlight was actually the monitoring that is occurring with the Maori case, specifically with Maori entrepreneurs. And so what we actually found was across sort of government reports and the literature was that, as you see in the screen, success for Maori businesses is as likely to be influenced by sociocultural objectives as economic success. And so on top of a lot of sort of your more conventional indicators, right, like an employment and revenue, what researchers and the government found was value-based approach in terms of monitoring is really is sort of the entire other half of defining success for Maori entrepreneurs. And so in this case, they really focus on, for instance, Maori identity, the presence of network and mentorship, as well as sort of family values. So there's a quote that's on the screen there that really sort of captures the importance of wanao, which is sort of is family in their language, and so you can imagine sort of the policy implications there, where a lot of that information in the press, in the absence of community-led monitoring, would be absent in policy decision-making processes. And so to really sort of design effective economic development-related policies, ensuring that there's sort of more value-based and community-based input, at least from the perspective of monitoring, really helps to capture a lot of the nuance that is missing from more conventional indicators. And so hopefully this provides a little bit of a recap of what we have, and I'll pass it on to Paige for concluding remarks.
Thanks, Arthur. So a bit of a summary, what we hope you walk away from our presentation with, that community representation and values-based visions is incredibly important. This is often part of project planning, but rarely does it carry out throughout a project. But our research showed that accountability mechanisms to stay true to community vision is important for success for the whole community. Investing in supportive education for all, regardless of age, gender, ability, or place in your career is incredibly important, so that people feel valued and people have the skills to deal with business challenges and new projects. And lastly, community deemed success. Ensure that communities are involved in determining what success means for them. So that's all we have for you today. Thank you for your time and attention, and we welcome your questions.
Great, thank you so much for that great presentation. I'd like to turn it over to Corinne to start, or Melanie.
So I just want to extend appreciation to the team. We had regular meetings over the course of the winter, the 2 terms, and we know that the work was much more comprehensive. And what we were looking for was the opportunities that we need to seize and the issues that we need to be aware of for the development of the Ksi Lisims LNG proposed project that will be proposed for about a 10-minute boat ride from this community. And we know this community because it's at the end of the Highway 113, the Nisga'a Highway, and it took 113 years for the finalization of, or ratification rather, of the Nisga'a Treaty. So the BC government was supportive of calling the Highway 113. So we know that because the highway terminates in Ging olx, that this community needs to be prepared for those opportunities. And we're really grateful for the insight that's been shared all through this term and the different models that have been examined. We know it was much more comprehensive than the presentation allowed, but we are looking forward to digging in deep and fully understanding what we need to be prepared for. So again, great appreciation to the team. Meaning keep up your good work. Thank you.
Melanie, did you have any questions as well?
Mahith, look, I don't necessarily have any questions. I do also want to convey my appreciation for all of the work. It's a great deal of sifting and digging through data to get to this point. I'm so appreciative of the way it's laid out on in the presentation, insofar as it's a good illustration that will be useful in making recommendations to our elected leadership who unfortunately weren't able to witness the presentation. But hopefully they'll be able to have be able to receive a more detailed report, because this indeed will form how we, or it will help to form how we'll be going forward in dealing with the project, which is so close to us, so close to our community, and as we really felt strongly that taking part in this project would benefit us to be ready, not just for benefiting from the from the revenue sharing that will come out of a project such as this, but also form a framework for how we deal with future projects. Because we know, and we've been told this by our forebearers who had the wherewithal to write declarations to the Queen in the late 1800s on why we need to be in charge of our own resources. We were told this generations ago that where we come from is so rich in resources and that our door will be knocked on by the outsiders. And here we are. So I look forward to the more in-depth report, the paper that's to be shared with us. We know that there's an article. I'm looking forward to reading that. It just, the presentation this afternoon to me demonstrated that we are absolutely taking a good approach as far as dividing the line, making sure that there is an actual line. It may not be in the right place at the moment, and this gives us the tools to take a good look at what we're doing now and what we need to be doing in the future. So I also want to say Ksi Lisims to the team for all of their work. It was eye-opening for me. Definitely intriguing to see all of the data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. So now we're going to turn it over to Julian Durkis, who is the faculty lead on the project. And while Julian is asking his questions, I encourage those on Zoom and the other room and this room to formulate your questions to follow up. Julian?
Good job, team. Fantastic. Nice to see this come to fruition after hard work for many months. One of the things that your comparison has done, right, is offer opportunities to learn from other projects. I've been wondering for a while are there opportunities for active collaboration between communities, and did you see any evidence of that anywhere? Because while many of the projects can be quite different, some are infrastructure focused, some are short-term, long-term, and many of the communities are of course quite different. Where would there be opportunities for communities to talk to each other and say, this piece we're maybe facing a similar challenge, and has that happened anywhere?
Right. So definitely that there's a lot of collaboration also going on. And so, for instance, when it comes to LNG development in particular, there's a particular organization called the First Nations LNG Alliance, which the Nisga'a Nation is a part of in collaboration with the Ksi Nation and other partners. And so when it comes to, especially when it comes to thinking about economic development in this context, then it's very not isolated. And in fact, if you're digging through the more initial project description and then the sort of consultations that's happening with Ksi Lisims, a lot of input is driven by sort of other communities, other community engagement as well. But when it comes to sort of the opportunities, I guess, for sort of knowledge transfers across communities, I think one thing that we've learned is that, yes, that definitely does exist, but that also that sort of information is, there's sort of this trade-off, because you also don't really want to kind of devolve into sort of a feedback loop of the same practices. So being conscious is that we also try to see if we can look at other jurisdictions outside of Canada to see whether or not there were other things that were sort of that needed to be mentioned or raised on top of sort of the existing more, maybe let's say provincial context that we first explored.
I mean, I would just add that from our conversations also with Corinne and Melanie, there was this clear sort of, and with other community members, there is information being passed between community members of different communities and that collaboration happening. But to your question, I don't think there are a lot of formal mechanisms whereby communities can come together to share their experiences and inform each other. And that would definitely be something I think we would all advocate for, because I think based on communities' learnings, other communities can gain a lot from it. And that's why we also based it all on case studies. Thank you.
Right, so I'll turn it over to Tina for a question on Zoom.
This question is from Ramanai. He says, great presentation. I know that the project scope did not involve evaluating the LNG project itself, but I assume that you and the community might be aware of the uncertainties in the future of natural gas market. Did you ever come across any discussion of how to deal with the potential shutdown of the project in the not too distant future?
Thank you for that question. I think the way I would sort of think about this is we did initially come across this idea of the market not being very conducive for a new project. And we did hear that from a few subject matter experts, which is why we wanted to explore more of economic development outside of the purview of just an infrastructure project, and what are some of the ways that they can foster economic development. Our article actually also spoke about considerations of equity while also achieving climate goal targets, right? So the way we thought about it was you still need to have, you have communities that need resources and support and haven't been able to achieve modernized economic success. And you have oil and gas companies that have all the success. And so when you're thinking about what projects should go through and not, considerations of equity need to be very important. So I hope that answers your question.
I mean, so this, and so I think one of the sort of, we really wanted to sort of focus on providing compendium and items that are useful really specifically for GVG. So naturally, if you look at sort of the global landscape of LNG and specifically within the Canadian context, currently, there's around, I think there's essentially no operating LNG terminal as of yet in Canada. So when it comes to sort of the development of a floating LNG facility, such as Ksi Lisims, it's really sort of the opportunity is sort of the thing that's very much stressed, but it's also sort of it's really kind of one of the first of its kind. And so, rather than sort of focusing on that, we wanted to kind of provide in general where that would fit in. And so that sort of that context really fits in with more so of how to deal with uncertainty in that case. And so in part, one of the sort of practices that we identified, which is monitoring, for instance, is about in the face of uncertainty. So including, for instance, the possibility of the LNG project due to economics not going through, how would a community be able to deal with it itself? Because we often think about the project falling through, and then this sort of narrative stops there. But there's actually a lot more community implications there too. And we're hoping to provide sort of a little bit of case studies outside that could maybe help in terms of potentially addressing those questions afterwards.
Okay, great. So Tim, we got a question for you. Can you turn the ceiling mic on? Great.
Thank you very much for a fine presentation. I was very struck by your first slide with visions, the themes and practices. And my question has to do with the first, which is on vision, because you emphasize community engagement consultation. This is a theme dear to the heart of those of us who teach 508. So I preface my comment by saying, I hope you will give us feedback, maybe even a module for future 508 courses. As survivors, I mean graduates of the, you owe it. So my question is, what were some of the challenges or what really surprised you in this process when you're trying to seriously shape your research questions in equal conversation with your community?
So when we were researching through community engagement, what we saw was that, especially when we spoke to one of the subject matter experts, he said that when we speak with members of the Indigenous community, there is hardly any mechanism to fully understand their knowledge. And that most of the research methods or questions that we engage into are very colonial centric, and they do not respect or fully understand what Indigenous knowledge is about. And so, small example, we hold interviews with our subject matter experts or community members. And when we started to talk about that, he said that they're actually not interviews when we talk to Indigenous members, because that really doesn't help, because it's a question answer session. And to engage with Indigenous community members, it's not really an appropriate format to do that, because there's hardly any knowledge transfer when it happens to that. More so with when we talk about in the project-centric focus, we've seen that community members want to express their concerns and say that, you know, how they would like the project to be. And also that the governments or local community, governments do give a space for that, but generally there is usually some sort of practices which, or some sort of communication errors, which kind of stress that entire process of transferring knowledge, which is why we again and again brought this theme that, you know, transparency and consultations need to be more expressive, need to be more lengthier or more community focused by talking to as many members of the community that they can.
Yeah, just to also great question, Tim, especially because of 508. But and the subject matter who spoke about this was also introduced to us by you. So the idea of what they really showed us, the subject matter expert in this case at least, was the importance of co-creation, going beyond consultations to co-create with community members, which in essence, you need to remove the power hierarchies that the academic world seems to imbue into any such research. And so we had to move away from our positionality of researchers as such to sort of building relationships, to centering their experience, that relationship, and building those values of trust with the community members to the extent that was possible, given that we could not go there or meet them in person. And we spoke to a few representative community members. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.